Well, Merry Christmas to all of you on this Christmas Sunday. It is rare for us to celebrate Christmas on a Sunday, so thank you for joining us for our one service this morning. Now, you will notice this morning that we have the children with us. So parents, do what you can with them. We understand it's going to be a little bit different this morning. We do have our cry room in the back if you need to. We also have a sermon playing in the lobby. If you need to head out there, you can still follow along out there if you feel like that's a more comfortable setting for your child. And I have tried to write and design the message for our expanded audience, including an abbreviation in time, so hopefully they can endure and we can endure and get through and see what God has to share with us here this morning. Now, Christmas as we know it is filled with many different symbols that are important to the Christmas season. Kids, I need your help on this one, okay? Kids, I have your attention. What is this Christmas symbol that you're looking at right now? What is it? Tell me. It's a Christmas tree, that's right. Did you know that the Christmas tree is a very, very old symbol with many different meanings through many different cultures going back hundreds and in some cases thousands of years? It goes back a very long time. Now to us, in our culture, the Christmas tree has become the centerpiece of our Christmas symbols and is often the centerpiece of our homes during the Christmas season. Now, kids, another question for you, and let me know, give me an answer here. What important things get placed underneath the Christmas tree during Christmas? Presents, that's right. It's where we put, and in your case, kids, where you find your Christmas gifts. Often on Sunday morning, or on Christmas morning, sometimes the night before, depending on the circumstances. Did any of you children here find Christmas gifts under the tree today? Raise your hand if you did. That's right, wonderful. We are thrilled. Did you get a chance to open them up and play with them a little bit? Yeah, then you had to get dressed and head out to church. I know how that is. I had to do the same thing this morning. All right, that's our first symbol. What's this second symbol that has a Christmas theme to it? The bells, that's right. Christmas bells. Did you know that the tradition of Christmas bells goes back almost 2,000 years? Right after Jesus came to earth and left, and the early church started, which is just under about 2,000 years ago, gatherings of people, they used to ring bells to tell the villages and the countryside that the Christmas service was about to begin. And so throughout the centuries, they would ring the bells. In fact, there's songs called Silver Bells. There's another song called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. And so bells are an important symbol for us with regard to Christmas and symbolizing Christmas. Now, there's a lot of other symbols related to Christmas, but there's a third one I want to look at this morning. And it's one you might not have heard of. It is called the Jesse tree. How many of you have heard of the Jesse tree before? Raise your hand. Okay, some of you have heard of the Jesse tree. Now, the Jesse tree is a tradition that goes back about 1,000 years to the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages is a period of time of about 1,000 years, from 500 years after Christ to about 1,500 years. And in the middle of that time, around 1,000 years ago, someone came up with the Jesse tree. Now, people who lived 1,000 years ago, kids, you might not know this, like you're learning how to read and write at home or in school, correct? Most people did not know how to read and write in the language that they spoke. Did you know that? Throughout their whole life, they never learned how to read. Not only that, but the language that the Bible is written in of that day was called Latin. Today we have language with the Bible in the languages English, Spanish, French, Chinese. Most languages you can think of, we have a Bible. But in that day, the language was in one Bible, and that language was Latin, and only the elite in the church, the most educated of the church, spoke Latin. So it was almost impossible to read a Bible. Additionally, there were no machines that made Bibles 1,000 years ago. How many of you have a Bible in your home? Raise your hand if you have a Bible in your home. All right? Did you know that there were no machines, there was no way to reproduce Bibles, and so you were lucky if your entire church had one Bible. Imagine if everybody here at Rooftop got together and we had one Bible to share for everybody to use. We can't even conceive that. Some of us have many Bibles. They sit on our shelves in all different colors and designs and styles. And so the people of the Middle Ages did not have a means to learn the stories of the Bible. And so the leaders of the church had to be creative. the people couldn't read, they didn't have Bibles in their possession, so they had to tell stories. They had to create memorable images by which people could remember the stories of the Bible because they still needed to teach their people what the Bible said. One of these examples is stained glass windows. You see this picture up there? We have our own stained glass windows. These windows don't exist simply to look nice on Sunday morning. They're actually supposed to be pictures for people who can't read to see and to be reminded of the story of Jesus and the story of the Bible. And so churches today, even though we can read, will still put them up in memory, but that was the purpose of stained glass windows. And likewise, the Jesse tree was a tool, a creative tool that was used by the church to teach about the Bible, and specifically was used to teach about the Old Testament leading up to the birth of Christ. It was especially popular at Christmas, which is appropriate considering today is Christmas and this is the Christmas season that we have been through. Now, the term Jesse tree comes from a passage in Isaiah chapter 11. If you don't know, the prophet Isaiah lived about 700 years before Jesus. And he said a lot of things about Jesus before Jesus was ever born that ended up coming true about Jesus. It's a big book in the Old Testament, prophesies a lot about things that will happen, and they do. But there's one passage that he mentions, Isaiah chapter 11, that I want to have us look at here this morning. And it says this, Isaiah 11, verses 1 and 2. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Now, what exactly does this verse mean? Well, the first question we want to answer is, who is Jesse? Anybody know who Jesse was? Who's the Jesse they're talking about? It's the father of David, King David, the famous king of Israel, King David. His father's name was Jesse. And then the branch they're referring to here is Jesus. From the ancestry of Jesse would come a man who would be the Messiah, the promised one of God. In fact, if you read the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, both of them talk about the lineage of Jesus. If you've ever read that and wondered, why are there all these so-and-so begat so-and-so and so-and-so gave birth to so-and-so, it's because they need to prove that Mary and Joseph both come from Jesse through King David. So both Gospels take a chapter almost and tell us that and remind us that he is, in fact, the promised one of Isaiah chapter 11. In short, Isaiah is telling us here that Jesus is the fruitful branch. And this branch will connect all the way back to King David and his father Jesse. And from what we know about the Old Testament, it will then connect all the way back to the very beginning, creation. Now, is that cool? Is it cool that Jesus can trace himself all the way back to the beginning, Genesis? Absolutely. It shows that God has a plan, that God was not just going happenstance through this. He was thinking this thing out. Now, we don't have time to get into all the details that I want to through the Old Testament to do it justice, of course, because I said we'd have an abbreviated time here this morning, and I promised you that, so I will hold to that. But I want to cover quickly and highlight a couple passages, especially from the Old Testament, that paint the picture of Jesus coming on this day, on Christmas morning. So we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 1. And we won't read the passage, but in the story of Genesis, as God is creating the universe and the earth, and he's creating things each day, he says something at the end of each day about creation. Do you know what God says? What does he say? It's good. That's right. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, he says it's good. And then on day 6, he creates people, human beings, Adam and Eve. He creates people like you and me. And he doesn't say it's good, he says something different. What does he say on that day? It's very good. And so we learn early on in Genesis chapter 1 how much God values creation and how much all the more he values people, you and I, the human race that he has created. Unfortunately, a couple chapters later, something bad happens, and we enter a chapter that's referred to as the fall. God instructs Adam and Eve how to live. He says, you can do all these things. You can do all these great things. There's only one thing you can't do, just one thing. You can do everything else. You'll live eternal, happy, joyous lives in my presence. There's just one thing you can't do. And yet, because like them, we always like to eventually find the one thing we're not supposed to do, right? Kiddos, do you sometimes when you're told not to do something, even though you know you're not supposed to do it, you decide, I kind of still want to do it anyway? It happens to us. It happens to all of us. And Adam and Eve did that. And when they did that, they sinned. It's called sin. It's rebellion from God. And God said that he had to punish sin. If you sin against God, your creator, there had to be a punishment. Because God has created us. We are his creatures. He is our loving, benevolent Father, our creator. But there is a consequence to disobedience, just like you and I face consequences to bad choices we make in our life here. And so God had to pronounce judgment. And in the story of Genesis chapter 3, as he's doling out the judgment, he tells Adam how he's going to struggle and suffer, tells Eve how she's going to struggle and suffer because of sin. And then he talks to this serpent who was in the garden, whom the Bible alludes to that the devil kind of came into to tempt Adam and Eve to disobey God. And he pronounces a judgment on the serpent. And he says something at the end of the last part of that judgment. He says this, speaking regarding the people, how the human race and the devil would interact. And he's talking specifically about, it doesn't say here, but he says this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, the offspring of the woman. And we believe here he's talking about Jesus because this is what he says. We believe Jesus shall bruise your head, shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And what he's foreshadowing is there's going to be trouble ahead. But I will send one who will ultimately win and defeat sin, defeat the devil, defeat the plans of evil in this world. But in the process, he who comes will be wounded and will incur a temporary wound. And what we know about the Bible, what we know about Jesus, did Jesus in fact die? Yes, but did he stay dead? No. He rose again. So even here in Genesis chapter 3, we see a foreshadowing of the story. All right, let's move forward several chapters. Now we're at the flood. All right, how many of you know about the flood? Raise your hand if you heard about the flood before. What's that thing that the people in the flood went into to avoid dying in the flood? What's it called? The ark, that's right. Well, sin of Adam and Eve got so bad on the earth that God decided, he says in a verse, that the thoughts of every person on the earth were evil all the time. And God said, I have to judge them. I must bring judgment upon the wickedness and the evil of these people. And so he did. And the only way you could escape the judgment of God was to believe that God was going to send judgment and to enter into this ark, this ship that you guys mentioned. And this ship wasn't a ship like we see today. It was like a big tomb. There weren't windows, there weren't doors to the outside, there weren't balconies to walk on like the big cruise ships. You went inside and you were stuck inside for months and months and months. And there's many parallels from the flood story and everything that happens here. But what we see is that the only people that survived the judgment of God were those that entered into the ark. As dismal and dreary as life in the ark was, those that entered into the ark survived. Well, what would happen thousands of years later is that God would send his son Jesus to die. And Jesus would enter into a tomb in his death for 3 days. But yet he would rise again. And when we baptize here at Rooftop, we tell people that when we enter into the water, we identify with Christ in his death. And we raise them up. We identify and we receive the new life that he received in his resurrection. And so as it was with Noah and his family, as they entered into the tomb of the ark to survive the judgment of God, so you and I must enter into the death of Jesus Christ if we hope to escape the judgment of God and to receive new life on the other side. Do you see this picture? Do you see this foreshadowing? Let's move forward a little bit further. There's a story of Abraham. Abraham, when God meets him, is just a regular Joe or a regular Abe walking around, and God says, I want to make you a great nation. And he decides, I'm going to make you special, I'm going to make all your descendants special, and through your descendants, I'm going to bless the whole world. And this is found in Genesis chapter 12. And he does. Do you know Abraham is the father of what people? Do you know? The Jewish people, the people of Israel who are still on the earth today. Some in this room can trace their lineage all the way back to Abraham. It's awesome. It's amazing. Well, in the midst of that, And these people tracing back, God says, through Abraham, I'm going to bless the whole world. Well, Abraham's the father of Jewish people, and Jesus himself was Jewish. And so when God says in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he sent his only son, that whoever believes in him might not perish, might not die, but have eternal life, God is fulfilling the promise of Genesis 12, that through Jesus I will bless the world. This happens in Isaac in Genesis 22. Through Joseph, there are pictures to be found talking about the Old Testament and how it paints a picture for what we are celebrating today, the coming of the Christ.